Yeah.
Alphabet.
B-L-I-P-H-A-L-E-T.
That's an easy one.
Leonard. Yeah, let's roll it all the way back. Once upon a time, there was the 17th century, and there was this place called Saugus, and actually a place called Braintree. And John Winthrop Jr. wanted to start an iron industry in the New World, so that all the money that they were raking in from, the Great Migration didn't have to go back to England to buy stuff. So they brought over people that were skilled in iron making. Now back in England, as a remnant of the Middle Ages, working with iron was a mystery, okay? And what that meant was it was passed down from father to son, because there wasn't much known about the science of it. It was really an art. So it tended to stay in families. The Leonard family was one of those families. There was a saying in New England that wherever there was a foundry or a forge, you'd find a Leonard. And it was pretty true. Certainly here in Easton, Taunton, and ultimately as far away as Vermont. There was another piddling little family that came over as well. That was the Ames family. They also were working in iron, but didn't have the great reputation that the Leonards had. They apparently were less skilled workers to start off with. So they came over, and the Leonard family moved down into Taunton, and when Easton came to be settled, the Leonards moved up in this area. And what they were looking for was something called bog iron. Bog iron is rust that precipitates out of the streams where the stream slows down. And eventually this rust piles up enough that it becomes a very low-grade ore of iron. About 5% of this piled up stuff is iron, and the rest of it's just junk. Okay? The good point about this is because there's so much, I think it's potassium, it might be potassium and phosphorus in it, it makes a very good cast iron, and that's what everybody wanted in those days, was cast iron pots to cook with and things. Anyway, one of the Leonards did discover bog iron here, and in 1713, James Leonard built a forge where Main Street touches on the bottom of Langwater Pond. That's our last stop if we make it that far. And started the iron industry here. His great-grandson, Alephilet III, built the dam that created Shovel Shop Pond. So one Leonard created Langwater Pond, and which at that time wasn't known, was probably known as Brummagem Forge Pond, because that's the name of the forge. It's had many names. Shovel Shops, obviously, when it was created in 1792, couldn't be called Shovel Shop because they built a nail factory there. And basically there were two buildings and a house. One building held the forge that made the bar iron, and one had the nail-making machine, because making nails by machine was a wonderful trick in 1793 that was becoming industrialized. For whatever reason, probably competition from iron being imported from Scandinavia, the nail company went broke in 1803, and for $1,600, Oliver Ames Jr., Oliver Ames Sr., the youngest of 10 children of John Ames of West Bridgewater, bought it out, changed the forge into the place where he made his shovels, and the nail factory into where he made the straps and handles. Okay. The idea that he had was for something that has become known as the Ames Bend. And the idea was he would take his shovel handles, soak them in the pond over here. And by the way, that's on the other side over there that we're talking about, not here. Soak them and put a bend in them. Now, if you stop and look at some garden shovels, they still have a very straight shaft to them. Well, that doesn't give you any leverage. Look at your snow shovel. It has a big bend in it. And the idea is it helps to give you leverage to pick things up. Ames had that idea, began to make shovels that way, and his sons began to refine it. It caused a lot of problems. There's a wonderful story that when the old man retired, he came in one day with one of the shovels in his hand, bent the blade, and started yelling and hollering at his two sons. And they had to convince him that this new method of making shovels, cheaper and flimsier, was the way to go. Why? Well, in England, labor was cheap, but tools were expensive. So you'd want a tool that would last forever and be very heavy. And it didn't matter if somebody got tired of using it, because you just hired 3 guys to do the job that over here we'd have 1 guy for. Why did we have 1 guy? Because we were new. The population of this country wasn't very good, so So what you'd want is a bunch of people who could work all day, and it didn't matter if the shovel wore out, because we had tons of raw material. There were trees and iron everywhere. So the Ames shovels were designed to wear out. But they were also designed to be cheap and make the best use out of labor. And that's what gave him a huge advantage. So production continued to grow, By the 1850s, they were making about 30 or 40,000 dozen shovels a year and shipping them all over the country. And on March 2nd, 1852, a huge fire broke out and burned the entire shovel company on that side to the ground. You would think that that would have been a huge blow, but the family pulled together, hired all the carpenters that they could find, and built a big, long shed, and were back in production in a couple of weeks. They also decided that they would never, ever again go through that, so they decided to build their next factory out of stone. The long shop over here is the first example of that, and ever since, all the Ames factory buildings in Easton, up until the glass house in 1928 and the office building in 1897, were built out of stone, so that the only thing that would burn, and even the huge beams inside wouldn't burn, they were just too big, was the roof. And we have pictures of a fire that took place in 1889. A roof burned through, but the building still stood, so their idea was good. This also represented sort of a shift as well, because by coming over here, they got a little bit away from using water power to turn their drip hammers. And the first steam engines were put in over here in 1852 and 1853. Now, the Ameses have money, and they still have money today. And the reason they have that is they didn't waste anything. They were good Yankees. So when this building over here, the lawn shop, was ready to go, they didn't knock down that shed over there. They simply divided it into 4 sections, waited for the pond to freeze, and dragged them across. And this house, that house, and she's there, and your house, 4 houses were made out of it. They were duplexes originally for worker houses. So they were dragged over. The pond froze. They cut up the sections and dragged them over. Yeah, most of the houses in Northeastern were built someplace else and dragged to their present location. It's weird, but if you had enough oxen and no wires to contend with, it was a relatively easy job to do, as long as you went slowly. Now we have this tranquil scene here, but you have to imagine the shovel company going full tilt either on that side of the pond or on this side of the pond. And you also have to imagine that there were buildings across the way in this open space, one of which was the Ames boarding house, where people who were less than permanent workers or single males were housed that were working here. And there were occasional fights and occasional scandals there. There was actually an example of the crime of fornication there that so incensed the population, and it incensed the population because it wasn't the Irish that were doing it, it were native sons and daughters that were doing it, that a posse arose, grabbed the criminals, and rode them around North